I'd love to invite you to a free Reclaimed Woman masterclass on June 5th. So this is for all my ladies who have followed the good independent girl rules and who still feel overwhelmed, resentful, and disappointed in their lives. You may think that you need to practice or learn or study how to be more soft and slow and abundant and pleasure-led as a feminine woman. Or maybe you think you have to be brave and courageous and finally stand up for what's yours. But the truth is that chasing femininity and fighting for power just leave you more wired, judgmental, and disconnected. I know what you need because I have walked this path into a deep love affair with myself. I know that you need a huge permission field, clear, manageable steps, and perhaps my fairy dust to help you remember who you are. Your femininity will naturally and spontaneously emerge when you feel safe. So learn how to give this safety to yourself and to attract those who offer it. I'll be teaching the 3 most important ways to turn pain into pleasure, including the source of all suffering and how to identify it, the only spiritual practice you'll ever need, and the key to true power as a woman. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to be safe in your body and in your world. No couples counseling, therapy, or international treaties required. To have clear intuitive signs in your body that you can trust. To experience creativity that inspires you to tears. To feel resilient in the face of judgment, criticism, and life curveballs. So join me for this free Reclaimed Woman Masterclass on June 5th at noon Eastern. There will be a special offer for 40 of the gals on the call. I will see you there. I'm Dr. Kelly Brogan. You may know me as a New York Times bestselling author of a book with an exploding pill on the cover, renegade psychiatrist, pole dancer, or honorary member of the Disinformation Dozen. What can I say? I'm a born provocateur. I've spent most of my recent life exposing deceptions, connecting dots, and discovering the secret places my inner victim is still waiting to be liberated. And now I feel called to help you reclaim all of your parts, your health, your sexuality, your power, and your expression, so that you can finally truly own yourself. I want to ignite in you that inner knowing and the pulsing vitality that lives beneath your disempowerment, disconnection, and resentment, so that you can audaciously, courageously, and playfully alchemize your struggle into the specific pleasure of who you are. This is Reclamation Radio, a Soulfire production. Hi, and welcome back to Reclamation Radio. I am Dr. Kelly Brogan, and I am so thrilled for this interview today. I've been looking forward to it for over a year. I wasn't sure I could manifest it, and I am really anticipating blowing many a mind today with this conversation, but maybe not also, because I am here with Laura Doyle, and she is the author, New York Times bestseller of The Surrendered Wife, which is the first book that I read with just the title, right? Just the title, right? And also The Empowered Wife. She has a podcast, and on her website, she boasts that over 15,000 broken marriages have been fixed better than new. She is my go-to resource for literally every single couple I know. I've become a proselytizing zealot for your work, and you have jailbroken me from so many of what I think were a lot of, and we'll get into this, like feminist, sort of echoes. And as somebody who has been awakening from a lot of feminist programming, and I would say specifically neoliberal feminist programming, I also was sort of ripened for your work and your message by many other avenues, Christian friends that I have and the values that, they were sharing with me and the way that they were embracing marriage, even scientists and researchers and career women choosing to have an experience of their home life that would have been anathema to me, even 5 years ago.
And I was ready to receive that. I also have been studying, David Deda's work and Omar Pani's work and polarity coaches who really encourage men and women to relate through intentional, organized energies to really kind of get in their lane. And when I encountered your work, it was probably a little over a year ago now. And I honestly don't remember. I have like a very mystical experience of books. Like they just arrive in my hands. I don't even remember where your book came from. And I remember I was sitting on a plane reading The Surrendered Wife, and I felt some degree of self-consciousness even about the title.
Yeah.
And then I finished it and I was like, okay, if I'm a controversial woman on the scene, how is this woman not burning at the stake? Like, I don't understand. So I am here, in your corner, cheering you on, because I think that you have such not only important message, but also the proof. I'm an outcomes girl. And I listen to your podcast and I hear woman after woman after woman come on and tell stories that would otherwise be unbelievable. I think if you didn't have the actual real live testimonials describing how these marital dynamics that anyone would leave for dead, I mean, just like totally dysfunctional, horrific situations, somehow turn around. So I want to welcome you, Laura, and I want to dive in really with your primary credential, right? Which is your own marital experience and how you got into the work that you do, really rabble rousing in the, marital health, if we could call it that, space, and specifically empowering women to change their experience of romantic relationships. So you could tell us a little bit about your background, your story. That would be an amazing place to start.
Well, I was the perfect wife, but then I got married, right? So that's the beginning of my sad story. Definitely not a relationship expert. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, by the way. I'm so honored to have you in my corner and reading The Surrendered Wife on a plane. So it does take some courage to crack that book with that title. So anyway, I was really happy to marry my husband on our wedding day. But a few years in, I just thought, well, I'm going to just improve him a little. I'm going to show him how to be more romantic and certainly more ambitious and tidier and eat healthier and maybe drive better and things like that. And so, he was avoiding me, and he was more interested in watching reruns than he was in talking to me, spending time with me, or even making love to me, which I thought, well, that's just weird. Definitely there's something wrong with him. So I knew what to do. I dragged him to marriage counseling. And I remember we went for over a year and we spent many thousands of dollars. And I remember sitting on the counselor's gray couch and realizing, like, oh, this is hopeless. I'm going to have to get divorced, or else I'm going to spend the rest of my life in a loveless marriage. So I felt like, that was the right decision, was to get divorced. I was going to have to, but I was too embarrassed to do that. So I decided, as a last ditch effort, I was going to ask women with happy marriages who had been married a really, really long time, which was 15 years, what their secrets were. Because if they could make it for 15 years, then they must know something, because I'd only been married a few years. And the things they said sounded crazy to me. Like, I didn't even understand. I remember them saying things. I'd be like, yeah, have you got anything else? Because and I'm a well-educated feminist myself, right? So I didn't want to, I knew my opinion counted and all that. But anyway, I started experimenting with their crazy suggestions. And it wasn't that long after that I walked through the door and my husband's face lit up. He was happy to see me again. And that had been gone. So I knew something was working. And it was very exciting, because I thought, okay, now I know what to do to have the kind of marriage I really wanted so badly, which was, playful and passionate. And I thought, okay, I can do this. I thought, now we're not going to have those big blowups in the car or the Cold Wars with no talking that last for days. And it wasn't that long after that we had a big blow up in the car again. And I thought, oh, okay, I know what to do, and I'm not doing it. And like, how sad would that be? Because before I just thought this is hopeless, but now I know where my power lies. I know some things that I can do, but I couldn't get myself to do them consistently. So I had the idea that I was going to recruit some of my girlfriends who were also complaining about their marriages. I'm like, okay, I'll get them to do this with me. And we had a little support group in my living room. There were 5 of us, and that worked. We were getting together and they were reporting miracles. One of them was like, My husband won the sales contest at work and he took her on the most romantic getaway of their lives. Another one said, you guys aren't going to think this is that big, but my husband painted the family room. And we've been arguing about him painting the family room for months. And not only did he do it, he did it with a smile. He was happy to do it. So we knew something was working. And someone said, can you write this all down, what we're doing for my cousin in Florida? And I was like, oh, yeah, I'll do that. We're in California. And that became my first book. That became The Surrendered Wife, and I was in my own little world. I thought, this is a beautiful title because surrendering it doesn't mean doormat or weak or wussy. It just means like when you're driving in traffic. You might wish the traffic would move, but you can't make it move. But you could decide to listen to a podcast or music you love. You could end up being grateful for the time. And just a surrendered wife just knows she can't control her husband. She doesn't tell him what to eat for lunch or, when to call his mom or go to the doctors or buy his underwear. And in turn, she just focuses on her own happiness. And it actually improves the intimacy and the connection and the playfulness. And it all comes roaring back to how it was when you first fell in love, in my experience. And now, when Dateline did a expose, they didn't always just do murders. They investigated my workshop on The Surrendered Wife, and they did an in-depth investigation of it. And the book with Surrendered Wife went to #1 on all of Amazon the next day. It's been published in 19 languages in 30 countries. It started a worldwide movement. I was just trying to fix my own marriage, and I knew I needed those other women to help me do that. And so anyway, I've been able to distill the techniques into 6 intimacy skills. That's what's in The Empowered Wife. And so my credentials are just, I am married now for nearly our 35th wedding anniversary in September. And it's the man of my dreams. And I have the marriage I always wanted. He grabs me in the hallway and just brings me in for a kiss. And it's staying in this conversation and talking about how to apply the intimacy skills and really just become my best self. I no longer nag or shriek or rage at him to get the things that I want in my relationship. And he's just always going so far out of his way to make sure I'm happy. He just wants to be my hero. And I want to be the princess. And that's what we're doing. So I'm just loving it.
Exactly. So I had a psychiatric practice in Manhattan for a decade. And I was happily married throughout. And I noted that I had an almost 100% divorce rate in my patients from beginning to end of work with me. Now, my work was in helping women to come off of psychiatric medications. So I sort of figured, well, it was, they were one woman when they started the meds, and now that they're off, they've changed, and it's just meant to dissolve. I didn't know what to make of the phenomenon. Then I went on to have an experience of a wild ride of a lifetime, and went through not one, but 2 divorces. So I am now twice divorced. And in my past couple of years of celibacy, I have dedicated myself to understanding what healthy love is, to learning how to love myself, and perhaps readying at some point in the future after my kids are out of the house for another shot at it, right? But what I have come to appreciate is really the sacred nature of the covenant of marriage. And I don't mean necessarily the legal license. I mean what it is to come together in service of this egregore, this third entity, God, if you will, or whatever it is that you are dedicating to that represents that union, right? So the sum greater than the parts. And I've heard you say, that you can have control or you can have intimacy. And that is exactly what I have observed is the nature of the shift from victim consciousness, which is a lot of what I study, into sovereign consciousness or mature adult consciousness that allows you to actually connect, with what is around you, let alone, this partner. So I watch now so many women, as I know you do, in these dynamics that are essentially warfare based, right? Like there are zero-sum games. And we have this enculturation to make, our partners wrong so that we can feel right. But the trouble is then you're married to somebody who is fundamentally wrong. It doesn't work. And I love the traffic analogy because when, you're externalized in your locus of control, it is really a root of so much suffering because you're in your childlike consciousness. So I wonder what you think, because I have all sorts of theories about how we got into this situation as women. But I wonder what you think about the core problem, right? Because if I think you and I agree that marriage serves women, it serves children. It is fundamentally, a covenant that has been maligned by so much of the feminist impulse. And I do think there is an opportunity to reclaim it.
Yeah.
So what do you imagine is at the core of, I've heard statistics, I don't know, you probably know better, 70% of women leaving their marriages. I left both. What do you think is going on? What do you think is the problem?
Well, I remember there was a study at the University of Toronto, and what they discovered is that women are more emotional than men. And I'm glad you're sitting down while I tell you this, right? Because shocker. And I mean, that was research money well spent, right? But I know for me, I am an emotional creature. I consider it a gift. We have emotional brilliance, us women. And I know for me, I had a lot of fear coming into my marriage that it wasn't rearing its head as much when I was first falling in love, but it was a part of me that I had long before I met my husband. And one of my big fears, I think we all have our own themes, right? Our own little fear friends. One of mine was fear of financial insecurity. So I had a subscription to Fear of Financial Insecurity daily. And I actually got it like 5 times a day, and I would read it and it would freak out every single time. Like, oh my gosh, and my fear was what was underlying my control. So I would say to my husband, like, I think you should ask for a raise, or I think you should try to get a better job, or I think you should try to get more money somehow. And all of that was my fear coming out, right? Like before that, I trusted him as he'd been a good provider. Anyway, and now all of a sudden I was really choosing that fear, and that was coming out as control. And really what he heard was, you don't make enough money. That was the subtext. And I'm such a powerful manifester. The man quit his job. He stopped making any money because that's what I was focused on was you don't make enough. And then I was livid. I was beyond resentful because now I'm the sole provider for the family, and it was unbearable. I just couldn't believe. And then because of the dynamics we were having, he also wouldn't do any housework. So I was like, what do I even need him for? Like, how is this even benefiting my life? So that control was really, that's what got us into the ditch in a big way. And it didn't seem possible. So then I would complain to my girlfriends, right? Like, oh my gosh, my husband's such a loser, McLoosey pants who's not even working and not even making money. And I remember around that time I had listened to Lee Miltier and learned about, I call it a spouse fulfilling prophecy. And she talked about how what you say to other people has a great deal to do with how they respond to you. And that concept kind of blew my mind, but I was like, what do I have to lose? And I remember coming up with my own spouse fulfilling prophecy for my husband, John. I said, you've always been a good provider. And then just for fun, I started also calling him Mr. Moneybags, because why not? And this kind of felt like a stretch, certainly, maybe a lie, really, because he wasn't providing at that time. But I started saying that, like, well, you've always been a good provider. And, and he'd, get a check or something. I'd say, oh, well, look at Mr. Moneybags. And then I remember around that time, he started his own company. And it was like right in his wheelhouse. He's a video guy, and he had a video company. And he was so successful. He was more successful with that company than he had been at any of his previous jobs. And it didn't seem like stretch at all anymore to just call him Mr. Moneybags and, see him as a great provider. So I just got my own demonstration of like, wow, my words, what I'm focusing on has so much power. So I could have gone with the fear and just left him and said, well, I've got to find a guy who's more ambitious and harder working or whatever. It was all up to me. But the journey that I went on that I think is so relevant to what you're talking about is really addressing that instead of just letting the malware run in my brain. Like, oh my gosh, we're not going to have enough money to pay the rent, or not, or I won't be able to pay the car registration or whatever. We're going to be homeless. To really arrest that malware and figure out how to focus on really finding my faith. It is kind of a spiritual journey in a way, but focusing on the experience I wanted to have instead of the one I didn't want to have, because what we focus on increases.
I would love to explore a little bit more about your perspective on how couples best manage finances, because I think there is so much that makes extraordinary sense and that I think does raise a lot of fear, especially for women who have been raised in, waves of feminism that suggest if you are not financially independent, and we have all of these egalitarian dynamics. We have women who are, more than half, I think the latest statistic of women in marriages are breadwinners. And you suggest that we consider relinquishing control over the finances. And really, you have this message woven throughout your work, which is to allow men to fail, right? Like to allow them to potentially not be perfect, allow them, as you described, allow him his moment of
exercising his right to be wrong, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So in your mind, what does it look like when a couple is properly harmonized around finances, like practically, like who's balancing the checkbook, who's paying the bills, who's pulling out the credit card? Is it different if a woman is working, right? Because I've become a believer as, somebody who's been the breadwinner, been the single woman earner. I am a believer in masculine providership. I believe that women are designed to be provided for. And if you want to be a 7-figure boss babe at the same time, wonderful. Because your creative energy is not going to pay the bills and keep the lights on. And I don't think that's how it was designed, as somebody who does that literally on a daily basis. So I wonder how you think we are best expressed, in this dyad when it comes to finances.
Well, I just know for me, right, when I first met my husband, he was working, he had a good job, and I was a full-time student who was broke. And so he was taking me out and was that provider. And I remember having this really embarrassing conversation where I was like, oh my gosh, I have so much credit card debt. And he was like, okay, how much? And I was like, $700. And he's like, how about if I pay that for you? And I was like, really? So that was certainly part of our courtship, was him being like, I will take care of you. And that was romantic. That was exciting. And then once we got married, I think even before that, I think even as we were living together before that, I was like, okay, I'm going to juggle all these bills. I'm going to balance this. I'm going to make sure we spend on the right things. And I would tell him like, hey, don't buy a Coke at the restaurant. We'd be out to dinner. I'm like, don't order a Coke. That is a ripoff. And that's where the restaurants make their biggest profit or whatever. It's like so embarrassing. But I got really controlling about the money, and I was trying to economize and juggle. And it was not that fun. We really lost something in that whole, I'll be your hero, and then I would get to feel taken care of. And so for me, it was like a journey to coming back to like, you know what? I really loved that feeling of being provided for. I desire that, and honoring that desire, and also kind of honoring that it stressed me out. It stressed me out to look at the money all the time and try to juggle it and figure it out. And also him not really knowing the score, let's say, right? Like in a basketball game, if he didn't see what was coming in or going out, like he was just kind of riding along. I felt like the mom and he was my little boy. And that's not a good sexual dynamic in your marriage, for sure. It was hurting us, for sure. And so for me, it was just the scariest thing in the world, since that is my fear friend, is financial insecurity, right? But it was also such an incredible, adventure, I guess, to relinquish control of the finances. I wasn't very good at it at first, but I was like, I'm too stressed. I can't do this. And he was like, okay, I'll do it. And it was awkward at first because he knew I didn't really trust him to do that at first. And I am a big earner. I always have been a pretty good earner myself. So it wasn't about, I can't make money. It was just about wanting to feel taken care of, trigger his hero gene. And that's what relinquishing control of the finances did for us, is all of a sudden, like when he started that business, right? He got so much more motive. That was going on at the same time. He got so much more motivated, like, oh, I can really provide for Laura. And I could also express my desires to him. And it, for whatever it was, I want to go to Hawaii, or I want to whatever. And then he got like, oh, I'm going to make that happen. I'm going to be her hero. And so if it required money, he's like, no problem. I'll go out and make some of that money so that she can have, she wants this bigger house or whatever. So that became very inspiring to him. So it's just a much nicer dynamic at our house. So it's something that I recommend that women experiment with if they're willing. I mean, all the intimacy skills are experiments. And that's probably, for me, it was one of the more terrifying ones, was relinquishing control of finances. We did have like a bumpy road. We got the electricity turned off twice, I remember. But then I realized like, oh, he can like learn about that. He can have life lessons instead of wife lessons. And he did. Like he figured it all out. Now it's great. So it's something that, it's not for the faint of heart. You've got to be courageous to do a lot of the intimacy skills. But for me, that's the exciting part of it is really figuring out what you're afraid of and making a different decision to experiment a little bit. And then finding out like, oh, you did actually make a wise choice when you married this man. You were smart back then. You weren't an idiot and neither was he. And let's go back to acting the way I did when I first fell in love and he was showing up that way and see if he shows up the way he did when he wooed you. And that's certainly what happened for us and for, so many thousands of women who have started using the intimacy skills.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I do think it is the great yearning of the feminine heart to trust and respect the man that we choose. And if we are the interference, that is being run between our lived experience and our that yearning becoming a reality, it means we have these opportunities, and it does not mean they're going to be comfortable necessarily. And I love how you articulate, and I say this to my girlfriends all the time who, we have this habit of, I call it commiseration connection. We have this habit as women of, complaining about the men in our lives, not just our partners. And I always say, get, off the fence, right?
Yeah.
That if you're choosing to be with this man, here are these skills. And I always, share your work that you can begin to play with to see what the potential is and to see whether or not you can have an experience of respecting and trusting this man that you chose. If you don't choose him any longer, there's the door.
Fine.
But to pick the lane.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you said that you weren't so great at finances. I have a lot of girlfriends and myself, I have a lot of competencies. I've developed a lot of these, what I would call masculine competencies. And I have a lot of friends who are frankly better at doing a lot of these life skills than their partners, or so they think, right? And that seems like the obvious shortcut is like, I'll do it because I can do it better. And I know that you've experienced that extending into all arenas of life, all of the details, like you said, whether it's, what to eat or how to dress or how to, how to paint the side of the garage. And you talk about how helping is one of the great symptoms of, an unhappy marriage, when you imagine that you are there to help your partner. But if some of us do recognize that we have a role in supporting our husband, right? What would you describe as the difference, right? So what is that sort of mommy-like control-based helping, and what is serving and supporting? Like if you bring him a sandwich because you imagine he's hungry, does that count? What about the laundry? We've already discussed not necessarily paying the bills just because you might be better at it. So how do you sort of make that distinction?
Yeah. I mean, I love that example. Well, this is still, okay, I got to tell you a quick story about Kathy Murray, who her second marriage was in a bad way. They were sleeping in separate beds for 6 months. And it looked like they were just about to get divorced too. They had a blended family. And she read The Surrendered Wife right when it came out. And she decided she was going to experiment with this phrase, whatever you think. And she was the CFO of a private school. So she was, to say she's good at money, right? I mean, she had managed like a $30 million budget at work or something. And so she was trying to help her husband be better with finances too. And anyway, she decided she was going to just go home and like experiment with relinquishing control and not being so helpful, I guess. So we would say, because helpful in wife language, I need a mic to drop for this. Helpful in wife language is critical in husband language, it turns out. So she went home and he said, oh, you got to help me figure out what to do with the cell phone. We need a new cell phone plan. So what do you want to do? And she goes, oh, you know what? Whatever you think. And he was like, what? Like, this is not normal for my wife. Like, he was like skeptical. He was mistrustful of this. So he's like, no, I need you to tell me what you want me to do, because he didn't want to get in trouble for doing it wrong. And she just stuck to her guns. She said, whatever you think, I trust you. And he was like, all right. And he went away and made the decision about the cell phone plan. And she was afraid he was going to mess it up. And he did fine. So that very night, he came over, he put his hand on her shoulder and he said, you were so nice today. And tears just rolled down her cheek. And they slept in the same bed for the first time in 6 months. And then she'd been going to marriage counseling for a year by herself, complaining about her husband every week. And nobody ever got happier that way by complaining about their spouse for an hour a week, as you know from your practice in Manhattan, right? But so anyway, she started training with me the next day. So that's over 20 years ago. And she still gets tears in her eyes when she talks about how tragic it would have been to throw away Doug, the love of her life, because she was so intent on helping him. So now that said, I mean, around here, I am the reheater and server of food at the very least. Sometimes I cook, but like to make him a sandwich or something, I love feeding my husband. Or I remember one time he called me on the way home from work and he was telling me about his day. And he said, "Now I'm going to come home and you're going to pour me a beer." And I was like, "Oh, yes, I am." Like it was he had this swagger about him. Right? I'm like, that's sexy. So, I mean, you always get to do whatever you want to do in your marriage, as helpful as you want to be. Now, would I buy my husband's underwear, make his doctor's appointments? Absolutely not, because I don't want to be in that mother role. So, I mean, this is where everybody gets to be the expert on their own lives and decide what fits for them. And even with the control, right? Sometimes I'll realize like, I'm about to say something that's controlling and that's going to cost me the intimacy because you can have one or the other, but you can't have both. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, that's worth it right now. I'm going to that's what I want. So I'm never going to be perfect as far as not being controlling. I'm pretty good. I'm better. I'm a lot better. Sometimes I have to apologize for being disrespectful for what I said. But I just think the news flash that a lot of my helpfulness was based in fear and control, and being able to experiment with not being so helpful that made my head explode. But it became a superpower to make that choice to maybe let him provide for me, let him support me, let him do for me. He made my cup of tea here this morning. And so I like to receive help. And I think as a woman, I know I'm built to receive physically. I consider that a metaphor for receiving lots of things I feel like I'm meant to receive: gifts, help, compliments, special treatment.
Yeah. I speak a lot about the victim triangle and the role of the rescuer or savior. And so this doesn't just apply to marital dynamics, because whenever we think that it's our job to help, especially when we have not explicitly been asked to do so, it is discharging discomfort that we can't hold in our own system. And it's infantilizing and reifying the victim consciousness of the person who we imagine we need to save, right? So that's probably the last thing you want to bring into this dynamic, and the fine line between, helping because you need to control the situation and you imagine you can do something better than the man who you are with because of his masculine competence, right? Like that is a virtue in a man, is his competence, his capability, his execution, his, action oriented life force. It's quite a different thing than feeling into how you can support him to, be a better man.
So maybe you've gotten the memo that our food and soil is depleted of minerals and trace elements, and you're wondering how to best supplement with those. So I personally take, and have for years, something called Kinton, which is from Quicksilver Scientific, and it is plasma seawater. It has over 78 bioavailable minerals and trace elements, and you can either take isotonic or hypertonic preparations depending on your needs. There's nothing else in it, no additives, nothing else, no sugar. And I personally feel the difference when I take it. So if you want to check it out, you can head over to show notes or go to quicksilverscientific.com/Kelly B, and you can use the code Kelly B at checkout to save 15% off your purchase. You mentioned couples counseling. I'd love to talk about this. I think this is mind blowing for a lot of folks, because what do people do when they're in the cold war?
Got to go to marriage counseling. You've got to
go to counseling, right? And I've done it myself. In fact, I worked with my first husband for a period of time with one of the best in the business, Esther Perel. I actually really love her and think she's brilliant. And I think the model itself is fundamentally emasculating at best. Right. So you came to this realization, and now you've operationalized this through your coaching practice, which is where I send folks, which is that couples counseling doesn't ever, in your experience, restore the marital dynamic and its health and vibrancy. And why do you think that is?
Well, I know for me, I wasn't there to look at how I could be a better wife. I just knew he was 99% of the problem, at least. And I was just there so she could fix him. So what a hypocrite, right? I was just very arrogant. But I do think it's a little bit of a hideout for hypocrites. If there's two of you in the room, lots of blaming can go on, lots of hurtful things. And that in the short term, that just feels so, like it's going to feel so satisfying to just tell somebody everything he's doing wrong and have them confront him on why he's acting like that and tell him to straighten up. But that wasn't satisfying. It wasn't, yeah, it didn't help us get closer. It didn't ever get me the marriage I really wanted. And besides that, though, there's also this other piece that I had no concept of, which is the piece about respect. I mean, I thought I was respectful, of course, because, I would let him know where I was, if I went out or whatever, I didn't leave a mess, or I'd reheat his dinner if he came home late. Right. Like I was thoughtful, and I was respectful of everything except for, the way he dressed and the way he drove and a bunch of things. So I had no concept of it. But I think one of the most disrespectful things you can possibly do is go into a stranger's office, sit on the couch, and in front of your husband, tell him everything he's not doing right, including like things in the bedroom that he's not doing right, or like all of that. So I felt like you start off with this deficit, this defensiveness of like being so disrespectful, and respect is like oxygen for husbands. So that, and then, I mean, I think our coaching organization, we have hundreds of coaches, and we only solely serve women. And that's because I believe that women are the keepers of the relationship. I had the power the whole time, just like Dorothy, didn't realize it. And when you can support the woman really experimenting with the skills and becoming her best self and feeling empowered and getting her desires and being, knowing what respect looks like, understanding the difference, and then feeling inspired and motivated to be respectful of the man she married, or to be vulnerable with him, to be grateful for things that he does. That is when it's like lightning. Like in a couple of weeks, she's like, I feel like I have a new husband. So, and that is not what's going on in couples counseling, right? There's a lot of complaining, criticizing. I mean, not across the board. And I think couples counselors are good people, like Esther Perel, right? Good people that got in for the right reasons. But I think the structure has been historically somewhat flawed. And so there's a better way. We don't have to focus on your childhood, on the past, on everything that went wrong. We can focus on the experience you want to be having now and creating your vision. What's the kind of marriage you want to have? If you have a magic wand and you can wave it, and we do, this is why we call the coaches fairy godmothers, right? Because they really have special powers to help you create your dream relationship with the man you have.
And I just want to reiterate for the people in the back that your outcomes, and I'd love to invite you if you have one top of mind, because I know you have so many to choose from. I mean, I listened to a podcast that was of yours that was a woman who was literally being, I know this is not typical, but physically abused while she was pregnant. Okay. So like if there are grounds for like this should end and the entire marriage turned around, in none of these cases, I think, involve the man reading books, taking special healing classes, doing trauma work, doing plant medicine. None of these instances involve his participation at all. And through one lens, that's saying, wow, we're already having a bad experience, and now you're expecting us to do all the freaking work. Like, how is this supportive of women? And through another lens, which is one I recognize from my own work, it's we had the power the entire time. We are alchemists, and it just requires a reframe and an opportunity to walk through a maturational portal into our adult consciousness, so that it's not necessarily altruism, right? Like, so that we can have the experience that we say we want as women. This is the way. So that is revolutionary, because if it only takes the woman to change the marriage, and it actually takes these relatively basic skills and catchphrases. I just said it to my gardener downstairs. I said, whatever you think about the color of the mulch, okay? But it just comes out once you orient towards how this becomes a safer world for us as women when we respect men, show them appreciation, and take opportunities to authentically express admiration, we create a safer world. And that's, to me, that is the origin of our pain, suffering, and struggle as women, is unsafety. So if we're trying to create a safer world, this is one of the ways. And it just takes a little practice, like you said, sometimes weeks. And I've had girlfriends who've operationalized and implemented your teachings, and they say the same thing within weeks. But it's humbling. It's very humbling, right?
Very, very.
Right. So I wonder if you could share, an outcome or two, just off the top of your head, of a story of what is possible, right? Like what is possible when it comes to, turning a marriage around. You said, you have 15,000, probably even more examples, because the ones I've seen haven't been cataloged on your site, right?
Yeah.
So there are probably even more out there. But what's an example of a woman using these, what you call the intimacy skills, we've touched on a couple, to turn the marriage around without the active participation or her direction, right? Because that's part of the flawed premise of couples therapy. Who initiates couples therapy? It's always
the
wife,
woman.
right?
Yeah.
So you're already directing.
Yeah.
You're already in your masculine.
Yeah.
You're already part of the problem, even just initiating the solution. So how could the solution ever come from that framework, right? So if you have any stories that illustrate what is possible when the woman takes this initiative for herself, let alone for her partner, I'd love to share those.
Well, I mean, I do love the story. I think I know the story you're referencing, actually, of she's a physician and she ended up in the ER from a physical fight with her husband while she was pregnant. And the EMT said to her, "Oh, you've got to leave. I come and get nice girls like you all the time. And, this time, you just have some bruises, but, next time you'll be dead. So you have to leave him," was her message. And she was in med school at the time. And, she's holding these pamphlets of these women's shelters she could go to. And she's thinking, but, I'm having a baby with my husband and I'm in medical school. And if I go live in a shelter right now, like, what's going to happen to me? So she went home and continued to have not such a physically violent relationship so much, but they certainly had a lot of conflict, and they had 2 daughters. She was pregnant with her first. So, and what's so remarkable about her story so she decided to focus on some other things about her husband, about why she had chosen him. And she had chosen him. She had very much said to him, "Hey, let's get married," when they first met and fell in love. And he was like, "Okay." And then she called her parents and said, "Hey, we're going to get married." And then she had picked him for a reason. So she decided to just go back to, what are those reasons? And, why did I think he was so special? And she had remembered, like, oh, he's been through so much and he has been so courageous and, been so successful in his life, even through these incredible challenges he's been through. And she admired that and respected that. And then she learned some of the skills, like she learned about how to resist bait. So bait is anything that your husband might say that's going to invite you to do that old dance, that same argument you've had millions of times, right? Thousands of times. And you don't want to have it anymore. So she learned some techniques, and she was so cute. She had this little song she had in her head when he said something where she would feel like, I've got to defend myself, or I've got to correct him. She would just sing to herself, just keep swimming, just keep swimming. That was her little song, swim past the bait. And she said that her marriage transformed so much, and that she was able to have so much peace in her home that it became like a playful, relaxed environment. We really play and laugh when we feel secure. When you're scared, you can't laugh. You're not joking. So anyway, so she was talking about that. And then because her marriage transformed so much, she's now training to become a Laura Doyle relationship coach. She wants to be an expert on the 6 intimacy skills and help out. I mean, she's a physician. She's got a big career already, very successful. But this made such a big difference in her marriage and to her daughters. She was so relieved as a mom to be able to provide that home court advantage of 2 parents who love each other. So she just felt like she was no longer going to focus on this incident. This, we'd call it domestic violence. It was domestic violence, basically, where she ended up in the hospital. And she instead was going to focus on the wonderful qualities about her husband. And now that's who she lives with. So it sounds like unbelievable, right? Yeah. It sounds fake. Like, thank goodness I have the podcast. I have them telling the stories in their own voices. Yeah. Because so much of it, you're like, that can't be right. And people say, oh, she's a domestic violence apologizer. People
Yeah, you're
accuse me of that.
enabling.
I'm
Right.
enabling. And I have to say, when I first wrote The Surrendered Wife, I was afraid too. I told people, oh, yeah, if he's physically abusive, you got to leave.
Right.
And like I was the expert on their life, right? So I was sad about that because I chose my fear instead of my faith. And I had to write a mea culpa later on. Like, I don't know. I didn't experience that. Every woman is the expert on her own life and she gets to decide what fits for her. And women have taught me when their husbands are having affairs, they're living with the other woman, they've moved out. They've said that I'm getting divorced. There's no hope. I remember Cindy. Cindy's a good example of that, where her husband, and she said, we were Christians. I never expected this to happen. So it could happen to anybody. But he took up with another woman. Then he moved out and he was living with the other woman. Everybody knew about it. And she went to marriage counseling for a long time. And the counselor said, well, we can't do anything until he ends that affair. He's got to stop first. And then she found the intimacy skills and started practicing those. And she really regretted. She's like, oh, I wish I didn't waste all that time in marriage counseling just waiting for him to become accountable and, own his part and end that affair, because she was able to become her best self. She practiced all the intimacy skills and magnetized him back, attracted him back. I remember how big we all celebrated. It took a couple years he was gone. And we all celebrated so big when she said, like, well, he's moving back. And then it's like, oh my gosh, he's home. And then like, oh my gosh, we have a good marriage again. And so those stories never get old to me. I'm always just so moved because of the courage and the commitment that it takes to save a marriage when it seems like it's beyond the pale.
So a lot of my friends want me to ask you about kids, right? So I know that you don't have children, but
I'm still the perfect mother.
Yes, yes. And right, exactly. It hasn't been contaminated. A lot of your clients are mothers, right? And you just described this situation where these two children were in the house that could have been described, as an abusive situation. And it sounds like that marriage was restored. I have become a fierce advocate for parents of children doing whatever it takes to stay together, because I've raised, my children in the setting of divorce. I'm blessed to have chosen an extraordinary father. Their dad, Andy, and I get along very well, and we have about as good as it can be. And it is still a wound that I could cry about in 10 seconds, that I don't think it'll ever feel something other than that. And if I just sometimes wonder, right? Like I've had, like I mentioned, a wild magic carpet ride of a life, and it's all been perfect and exactly what it needed to be for me to actualize and individuate and awaken and ignite all of these different aspects of myself. And I just wonder, like what could have been possible had I known what I know now about the role that a woman can play as a wife. And so if we are on the same page about encouraging mothers to do whatever it takes to keep, the marriage to the father of their children intact. And everybody knows who's raised, especially young kids, that it's like an all hands on deck situation. It's not an easy polarity to nurture, right? Where, you're concerning yourself even on a daily basis about how to nurture the marriage, because there's so much focus on just like getting the shit done that needs to get done and taking care of the basic logistics. And you become these really kind of like egalitarian partners in a business, when you are both parents. So I wonder what you've observed and learned about how the skills translate in the setting of, or if there are any modifications or adjustments or caveats, in the setting of a household where, the wife is a mother.
Yeah. Well, I know for me that anytime I should do something, like I'm so contrary, I'm such a rebel. Like I don't want to do what I should do. I want what I want, which is to feel desired, feel taken care of, to feel adored, to feel cherished. So for me, like, I guess I would never say to a mom, like, hey, you've got to stay married for the kids. What I would say to her is like, yeah, it really sucks to be in a struggling marriage. I still remember how hard it was, how stressful it was. And, what I want for her is for her to feel desired, taken care of, and cherished. And I think she can have that. And I know that every mother really wants the world for her child, right? That's universal. And, is having that home court advantage of two parents who love each other? Is it, is that a way to give them the world? I think so. I certainly think that, I think most women want to give them that, right? And want the husbands to be, or, want the fathers to be the best fathers that they can possibly be, right? So I think I think the really delightful part about this is her finding out like how much influence she has over that relationship. And how, I love the stories. Like I remember one woman was trying to get out of the way of, she had it was her second husband. So it was a stepfather to her 17-year-old son. And she heard the husband swearing at the son, like being super harsh, inappropriate. And it just broke her mama bear heart. And she wanted to run in and protect the 17-year-old boy. And she decided to experiment with that a little bit. She decided to not interfere because she wanted to see what would happen differently. She was experimenting with the intimacy skills. And so she didn't. And she said she just went into her room to try to like stay out of it. And she was so shocked. A few minutes later, she heard them both in the kid's bedroom. They were both apologizing to each other. The father had apologized. Then the son apologized to the stepfather. And then they were both crying. They were both crying. And it just melted her like, oh my gosh, when I stay out of this relationship, they find their own way. And it's maybe not going to look the way you think it's going to look. So I think it's kind of exciting to think about what's possible, not to stay together for the kids, but hey, let's get you everything. I mean, I think your desires are important, right? You want to have a hero, or you want to feel safe. You want to feel beautiful, right? Who doesn't want to feel like the most beautiful woman in the world to their man, right? To have him just admire her. Let's get you that. Let's get you all the good stuff in marriage so that it's not a matter of staying together for the kids. It's a matter of like, who would want to leave a relationship like this where it's playful and passionate all the time? Like, sign me up for that.
You use the phrase duct tape, and it's related to what you were describing, and even with sort of like singing yourself a song rather than intervening, right? And always exercising this impulse to know better, to feel superior. Honestly, that's what a lot of this stems from, and to meddle. I have observed, and I think you would agree because you mentioned it already, that driving, right, is probably one of the most diagnostic experiences that we have in partnership. When you as a woman, let's say you're in the passenger seat, when you cannot suppress your micromanagement of his driving, whether it's directions, that used to be a big one for me. Of course, there's a metaphor in there, right? Like knowing that, oh, no, we turn there, kind of a thing, or you're driving too fast, or watch out, all of this passenger seat driving, literally and metaphorically, that we do. And I have like challenged, the women that I work with and talk to observe themselves as they drive with their husbands and to see if it's possible. I mean, you're choosing to it's the same thing. You're choosing to get in the car. If you don't feel comfortable getting in the car, maybe either you should ask to drive and have that kind of dynamic, or I don't know, Uber or whatever, right? Or stay where you are. If you're choosing to get in the car, it means that you are implying trust in the navigational capacity of this individual. So can you just shut up, right? Like, can you just not say anything and put the duct tape on? And it sounds like, this duct tape concept of simply not saying the thing, right? So you do give a lot of phrases that are super helpful, like whatever you think, when you're asked for your advice, because we love to give our advice and we love to feel consulted. Right. So instead, you say whatever you think. You don't take the bait of advising your man how to do his life better than he would otherwise know. But it sounds like there are other situations where you recommend just not saying anything. If you could speak to that.
Well, again, it's like, what's the price of admission here? And is it worthwhile? It's kind of funny. I'm cringing a little bit as you're saying this, Tess, because I'm still not such a good passenger. Like, it's not one of my strengths still. It's like I can still get in the car and go, oh my gosh, aren't you going to take the freeway? So it's funny. I'm still working on that one. And I think whenever fear comes up, I think being a passenger is actually kind of hard. You can see everything, but you have no control, right? It's a perfect metaphor. So, I mean, and it's always there for us, I guess you'd say. Like me being a passenger and opening my, and not wearing my duct tape, right? Not controlling myself is going to have a cost, right? I think my husband, I mean, it's kind of almost a joke now because he's like, "Oh yeah, are you okay? Are you gonna do that now, right? You're gonna tell me what to do." I remember one time he picked me up from the airport and I had not done any kind of self-care that I would normally like to do. I remember had gotten up early, so I was sleep deprived. I was really hungry, just a cranky mess when he picked me up from the airport. And I started telling him like, no, don't go that way. No, you should go this way. And he looked at me and he just was like, well, it's nice to see you too. And I was so busted, right? I had to laugh because yeah, he was calling me out. Now he's used to being respected. So if I get controlling like that, he knows that's not who I want to be. And so he can call me out. And now I have the ability to just kind of switch in like, okay, yeah, I'd rather be the best Laura I can be, which is a more respectful, like, thanks for picking me up. Thanks for driving me around rather than telling him what to do while we're in the car. So, but I think, it takes a little focus to get there if your habit is to be controlling.
So you and I speak the same language about self-care, which was one of the, I don't know if you call it self-care, but the intimacy skills that really allowed me to see I am in a very resonant space here because I have come to believe that a woman taking care of herself, prioritizing her own pleasure, her own happiness, her own fulfillment, and knowing what that is, that this is actually the greatest contribution and most disruptive contribution we can make as women. And you encourage that, and you just referenced it. And from that self-orientation comes an understanding of a relationship with desire. And you talk about expressing pure desire. And I thought that was such an incredible reframe for me, and actually even teach it to my daughters, because our tendency is to really cloak our desire, sometimes in an offer, sometimes in a suggestion, right? So we might say, we should go out to dinner.
Yeah.
Or we should go on vacation, or maybe it'll be negative and critical, right? We never
complaint.
go dancing anymore when our birthright is to channel, right, desire through our hearts as women. And that expressing that is very simple, right? And you talk about how it could be as simple as saying like, I'd love, right? I'd love to go to dinner. I'd love to go on vacation. I'd love to go dancing. And you use this metaphor for the sort of comprehensive experience around this of the restaurant, right? Like ordering a meal at a restaurant. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how we can really just simplify our relationship to desire when we know what it is that we want, which is not always easy. And there's right so much obscuring that, how organizing it can be to stay with pure desire.
Yeah, I love so much that you're teaching your daughters how to express their desires in a way that inspires, because for me, this is like the number one thing I feel like every woman needs to know this, because I spent so many years complaining and saying like, I remember saying like, John, this kitchen is a disaster. Or, John, I cooked, so you have to do the dishes. Or, hey, John, why don't you clean the kitchen? How about if you clean the kitchen? And like, none of it got me a clean kitchen. Not one time did that ever work and I don't even think he could hear me. He just heard like, John, blah, 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 and I don't think anyone can hear us when we're complaining. So it wasn't until I learned this magical phrase. And I feel like if you're listening, just write this down. Just write it down. It's I would love, and then just the final outcome. So I just remember I said, I would love a clean kitchen. And he goes, okay, I'll clean it. And he did. And that was over 20 years ago. And he's been cleaning it ever since. And I do not do dishes around here. That's how motivated the man is to make his wife happy. Why does he do them every day? He knows it makes me happy. And it really does make me so happy that I don't have to ever do the dishes. So, and it was such a big point of contention. So being able to express a desire, and they do become uncomfortable. I remember when I long wanted to have a pool, but we don't have any kids. So I couldn't say I wanted it for the kids. I have to just admit that I want this really like indulgent thing, a pool, right? You don't need a pool. I just want a pool. But finally I decided like, you know what? I'm going to just honor that desire. I'm going to hold it close instead of kind of like, oh yeah, it'd be great to have a pool or whatever. And as soon as I did, like my husband moved heaven and earth, and we got Like we have a glorious backyard resort now. And what was stopping me from having a pool? Me. I couldn't own that desire. It felt too vulnerable. Anyway, so now I have it. And this is what we see. Just in fact, the coaches and I, we just had a storytelling meeting on expressing desires in a way that inspires. And everybody's just, I wanted another baby. And, I just expressed it as a pure desire. And he's like, okay. And next thing you know, we're pregnant. It's from little things to, I would love a cup of coffee to, I would love to live closer to my parents. I would love a new car. And it just always feels like a miracle when things rearrange. One of the coaches was telling a story about how her husband wanted to build a brand new house and she wasn't that into it. And she loved the house they were living in. And then she said, well, I just would love if we could somehow live in this house while we're building that house. And then he was like, well, financially, we can't do that. And she's like, I know, but I would love it. So this is a great example of having a desire without control or expectation or blame or criticism kind of hidden in there. She just wanted it. And then a realtor called them and said, hey, I have a customer who wants this kind of house, blah, blah, blah. And your house checks all the boxes. Are you interested in selling? And she's like, well, I don't know. What we wanted to do is live here for 6 more months. Anyway, they ended up getting to stay in that house for 6 months after they sold it while they were building the new house. So just a complete miracle. Like, how does that happen? And sometimes it's our husband making those desires come true. And sometimes it's us. Sometimes we are making our own desires come true. Or sometimes the universe just rearranges itself in its conspiracy for our greatest happiness. And then we get what we always wanted.
And then our only job is to stay fiercely aligned with our own desire, with our own self-nurturance, with our own self-fulfillment, and to express that and mature beyond these reflexes that are based in, I would say, childhood psychology and associated fears and wounds, because the nature of the man-woman dyad is such that he is literally designed to be fulfilled by solving the problem of your unhappiness, right? Like, it's such a beautiful technology and
so complementary.
Yes. Yeah. And that is the nature of complementarity, which is so different from the warfare mentality we're steeped in and the zero-sum games that we bring, to bear in this dynamic that is designed for intimacy. And I actually have, all sorts of conspiracy theories about the dismantling of, the union and why that would serve so many agendas that can only be played out when we are atomized, right? When we're in, broken homes and children are raised in this kind of situation and women are fending for themselves, imagining that we have won, and are enjoying all the fruits of feminism. And meanwhile, we're like exhausted and flailing and really bereft. So I think this is such vital information. And, all of the skills, you have downloads on your site and they're all in your book, and you have so many resources and so much information. It's quite basic. Like, I find that truth, first of all, it always feels good. And it always feels like a remembrance. It's like, oh yeah, oh yeah, okay. And it doesn't mean that it's not, like you said, an act of courage to move in the direction of holding that vulnerability, but you get better at it, right? Like, you practice it and you get better at it. And I mean, you modeled it in this hour. Like, you are a woman. I hoped that I also am this woman, who models just taking responsibility, like just owning it. It's actually funny, right? Like, it's funny how we can be.
Oh, God, you're mortal women, right?
Yes, and it takes the piss out of it. And ultimately it becomes the channel through which we access, that which we say that we want. So I love this. I want to ask one final question, just out of curiosity. Like, what is the nature, Laura, of the pushback that you've gotten? Have you gotten it? I'm assuming you have. I haven't been exposed to it. I haven't seen any, trolling or hate websites set up, but I imagine that they must exist, and there must be some pushback. I've gotten a lot from the neoliberal feminist world, and I considered myself, one of their kind at the beginning of my own, focus on women's empowerment work and, sort of weaving in traditional values, et cetera. So I'm just curious, like, what have been the criticisms? You mentioned abuse enabling, kind of, sort of framing of what it is that you're doing. Who else has come after you?
Well, as you say it, I mean, I just know I have my critics. I'm not aware of any hate sites. So I'm like, I'm doing pretty good. I don't have a hate site, I guess. Or maybe that's a bad sign. Like, not enough people have heard about me yet, but I certainly get a lot of love. I get so much love every day. So I'm grateful for that. There's so many women who have taken up the mission to end world divorce with me, that they feel called to that as well. So yeah, I mean, and I have this theory, that I wasn't ready to read my book until I wrote it. Like if someone would have given me this friend or wife early on in my marriage, I would have probably thrown it at them and said, we talk about everything and I'm a feminist and whatever, whatever I would have said, I wasn't ready yet. And so not everybody is ready or interested. This is their path. And that's okay. Everybody's, she gets to be the expert in her life. So, this, for me, the books, the coaching program, the podcast, the Empowered Wife book that lays out the 6 intimacy skills is all there for women who want it, who are wondering what happened to their marriage. Why is it such a struggle? Why is it so hard? And this is my experience, and it might help you too. It's helped, over 15,000 women fix their marriages. So, but it really just has to be that. It just has to be like, some people are going to like chocolate and some people are going to like vanilla. And so this is an exciting path for me and for you. And I think for a lot of women it's because it feels, I think empowering is really the right word. Like you get in touch with your gifts, the 5 gifts of the feminine and femininity, of the things that you really are meant to provide in your relationship and your relationship depends on, and that the world depends on for strong families, strong communities, strong countries, strong world. So I think it's exciting.
I couldn't agree more. And I also recognize, because you have memberships and you gather women around each other, the role that we can play in each other's lives in service of the collective, in service of men, in service of children. And I'm not sure there's anything more powerful than that. And it requires that we recognize the responsibility that we have. I think that's why, one of the most common criticisms that I've gotten is that I am a victim shamer, right? So that is sometimes the frame in the dominant narrative of the, sort of call to personal responsibility, right? When we'd rather be coddled, when we rather just, collect all of the compassion and the sort of poor you energy that reifies our powerlessness rather than take responsibility and make changes in the direction of what it is that we say we want, so as to resolve that kink, I call it, of, really fetishized victim consciousness. And it feels good until you know what else is possible. And I think you really have you've showcased that. You've given the tools and steps. They're easy to learn and recognize, maybe challenging on some level to implement, but I know they get easier over time. I think these skills extend, as I'm sure you would agree, to so many other dynamics and experiences as a woman, as a mother in life. And I'm just so grateful, for your voice, for your humility, for, this extraordinary empire that you've grown, and you really have an ally in me. So thank you for this conversation. And I'll make sure all of the links are in the show notes, Laura.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Yeah, what a pleasure. This has been a treat. Thanks for having me on your show.